to my right, joining us, AFN National Chief RoseAnne Archibald. Thank you so much for giving us time today. Lovely to have you.
Yeah, thank you. It's an important day, and I'm happy to be here.
Now, I guess as a first question, you are not one of the speakers who is slated to appear on stage today, so tell us, what is your message and takeaway from today?
Today is really about survivors, and it's about those children who suffered in those institutions and survived, and it's also about the many little ones and children who died in those institutions. And so it's more of a somber day in my view, a time to reflect and pause and look at where we are on the road to reconciliation. And particularly, it's a day to speak truth and to acknowledge truth and to share that truth with everyone across Turtle Island.
Now, obviously, the process for survivors feeling comfortable enough to talk about their experiences is probably going to play out for the next couple of years. So something to focus on now, the calls to action from the TRC. Only about 10% of those calls to action have been addressed by the government. What's your impression on that piece?
It was something I mentioned to another journalist that at this rate, it would take 40 years to complete all of those 94 calls to action, which is not acceptable. And so the federal government, provincial governments, municipal governments, and all the partners mentioned in those calls to action have to find a way to accelerate and reach all of those goals that were recommendations from survivors. It's really important for people to understand that this came out of a larger TRC report, and it is survivor driven. So it's not a government document. It's a document that comes from the hearts and minds of those children who survived the institutions.
What is the AFN's role then in accelerating that process?
We want to be a good partner and do our part. However, the real responsibility rests on those governments to step up and do the work that needs to be done. And hopefully, as we move through more and more of these days in the years ahead, it'll bring that awareness to the rest of the country, so to speak. And it also is important to have our allies, our non-Indigenous allies, first of all, read the smaller booklet, which has just the 94 calls in it, and then if they can read the larger report, that would be great. And for them to talk to their governments, whether it's their MP, the Prime Minister, MPPs, MLAs, mayors, councillors, and say, hey, we want this report to be fully implemented. We want all the calls to be answered. What are you going to do about it? So we really need a call to action to our allies out there.
Now, speaking of allyship, as you can see from the turnout and the way that provinces have embraced this day of commemoration, people agree that it is necessary. However, there are some provinces that are not acknowledging it in the same way, so Quebec being one of them. What kind of message does that send?
Over time, I would be hopeful that citizens in those provinces pressure their governments to follow through and make this day a national holiday and a statutory holiday in their provinces. What it says right now is that people, particularly in like Quebec and other provinces that aren't following suit, are further back on the road to reconciliation, and they need to catch up. They need to get with the times. They need to embrace the truth of this country. You know, I don't call them schools anymore. People call them Indian residential schools, but to me, they were institutions of assimilation and genocide. And even the Pope himself, as he left the country, was asked whether he believed that genocide happened here, and he said yes. Genocide happened here. And so that truth must be told over and over, and not just to say the negative part of it, but what are we going to do about it? How are we going to heal from it? How are we going to move forward from it? Those are really important questions to answer as we move forward in a healing process, what we call the healing path forward.
And again, touching on the situation in Quebec, we just marked 2 years since Joyce Echaquan's passing, and the government's still reluctant to acknowledge systemic racism as being the root of the problem. Can we have the progress that you're talking about without that acknowledgement and acceptance that there is a system, or there was a system, of racism that existed?
Obviously, the first step in addressing a problem is to acknowledge the truth. And the fact that there is a resistance to the truth about systemic racism in the province of Quebec is a definite barrier to reconciliation. And it's work that is, the First Nations in Quebec are doing great work, like Regional Chief Ghislain Picard is doing that work of moving those kinds of truths forward and trying to create a space for healing and trying to create justice, equality, and equity for those First Nations. So we continue to work on it. And we're going to be relentless about it. Just because somebody says no to you the first time on something as truthful as, the history of this country or systemic racism that exists here, the first denial means nothing to me. You have to just keep being relentless in the pursuit of truth and justice.
Okay. Any final thoughts before we leave you for today?
This is the second event I attended, and I was in Regina yesterday, and I'm so heartened to see so many non-Indigenous allies joining us in these walks, in these events, because I know that over time they are going to learn and have more knowledge, and that knowledge will build empathy, and that empathy will lead us on that healing path forward, and that healing path forward will lead us into a place where our children are happy and healthy, surrounded by the love and care of their families, living in safe and vibrant communities. And that's our vision. That's our collective vision. And I believe that we will get there one day, and I'm not sure when, but I believe in that vision.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, RoseAnne Archibald, for joining us. Many, many more voices to be heard from today, so stay tuned with us for all of the latest.